The cabin hummed with the quiet of a late evening flight. Most passengers had slipped into restless sleep or stared blankly at the seatback screens. Somewhere in row 26, Grace Holloway shifted slightly, adjusting her daughter's head against her chest. Mila, barely 2, was beginning to stir. A soft whimper, then a fretful kick under the airline blanket. Grace began to hum. It was a lullaby, rare, slow, and unmistakably old. The kind sung by grandmothers in villages that no longer appeared on maps. Serbian, with notes that seemed to sway like wheat under wind. Her voice was barely more than breath, yet it cut through the recycled air like something ancient and alive. 3 rows ahead, in first class, Dean Carter stirred. He didn't recognize the tune, not really, and didn't care to. He'd been finalizing notes on a language-learning prototype, something about voice pattern mapping and tonal drift. The hum reached him again, soft and steady. He paused, thumb over screen. By the time he looked back, the sound had faded. Later, when the fasten seatbelt sign blinked off and the plane settled into steady cruising, Grace stood to rock Mila gently, whispering to calm her. Near the lavatory, a lost-looking tourist hovered over a map and a boarding pass. German. Confused. Grace glanced once, then slid into fluent German with the ease of muscle memory. 2 short phrases, a small smile, and the woman's shoulders dropped in relief. Dean watched this, not closely, just enough to notice. She returned to her seat quietly, unaware she had been seen. As the plane began its slow descent into New Orleans, a flight attendant passed through, reciting the landing menu. When she stumbled over a French phrase, Grace corrected her softly. No condescension, no eye contact, just a gentle course correction. Dean blinked. The same woman. Again. When the seatbelt sign dinged on, he stood, stepped back into economy, and traded spots with a man 2 rows behind Grace. He said nothing, just settled beside her, pretending to fidget with his watch. She didn't look up. Mila, now asleep, murmured something in Spanish. Grace replied with the same softness she had used for the lullaby, this time in Spanish too. Then to Mila, almost there, baby. We're home. Her voice in English carried the unmistakable southern drawl of someone born and shaped by heat and loss. Dean said nothing, but something in him, a blueprint, a memory, a door shifted. The plane touched down with a shudder, tires skimming the tarmac in that familiar dance between flight and gravity. Grace didn't flinch. Her hand stayed firm on Mila's back, steady even as the cabin brightened with overhead lights and the clatter of passengers reclaiming their lives. Dean remained silent beside her, watching from the corner of his eye as she gathered their few belongings. A backpack patched at the seams, a tiny bear with 1 missing eye, a blanket that smelled faintly of lavender and plastic. Everything she owned was neatly folded, efficient, maternal. Outside the gate, the crowd dispersed in waves, businessmen sprinting toward meetings, tourists stretching their backs, families reuniting in hugs. Grace lingered near the baggage carousel, one hip jutting out slightly as she shifted Mila's weight. She murmured something in Portuguese, just enough to coax the toddler into patience. Dean approached casually, hands in his pockets. "Excuse me," he said, his voice even. "You helped that woman on the plane. The German one." Grace turned, eyes narrowing slightly. Mila looked up, then nestled deeper into her mother's neck. "Yes," Grace said, cautious. "I wanted to ask you something," he continued. "I'm working on a project. It involves language acquisition, tech stuff mostly. But we've hit a wall in the nuance department." Grace didn't respond, just waited. He pulled out his phone, opened a document, and tilted it toward her. "Would you mind looking at this? It's a translation matrix we're beta testing. This one's in Japanese." She glanced at it once, then again. Her mouth twisted. "This kanji means sorrow, not reflection. That changes the entire sentence." Dean raised an eyebrow. "You read Japanese?" "I read context," she said simply. "That's what your program's missing. Words don't live in dictionaries. They live in memory, tone, silence." He nodded slowly. "Would you meet with me again? We have a closed session in Austin next week. Developers, linguists, investors. I just want you in the room. Her eyes hardened. Why? No promises, he said. You can leave any time. I just want you to be there. Grace exhaled slowly. Her gaze flicked toward Mila, then back at Dean. If I say no? He shrugged. Then I thank you for the correction and wish you well. She studied him for a long moment, weighing the weight of his offer. I'll think about it, she said. He reached into his wallet and pulled out a card. No title. Just his name, a private number, and a time. Just show up, he said. You don't have to speak. She took it. Didn't promise anything. For days later, Grace walked into the glass-paneled office building in downtown Austin, clutching Mila's old diaper bag like a shield. The receptionist looked up, startled by her presence. Too plain, too out of place in this polished world. Grace said nothing. She followed the directions to a conference room marked internal only. Inside, it was a different world. Suits, laptops, jargon, cold brew in glass bottles. Everyone spoke in clipped tones, efficiency over empathy. She slipped into a chair in the back, unnoticed, until someone got it wrong. A man in a tight blazer began confidently outlining a regulation in cross-border data sharing. He misquoted the Israeli clause. Grace, without raising her voice, said, "That document was revised in 2019. The Hebrew clause was amended. You're quoting the outdated version." Silence dropped over the room like a stone. Dean looked up from his notes, met her gaze, nodded once. "Let's continue," he said. The room obeyed. Grace stayed until the end, said nothing else. But they all remembered her. The message came 3 days later. It wasn't signed. Her status is unconfirmed. Please clarify her authorization. Grace read it twice. No greeting, no punctuation. Just cold, clean dismissal masked as procedure. She sat with it in silence. Outside, Mila was curled up on the carpet with a pile of coloring books, humming to herself in 4 languages. Grace stared at the email, then closed her laptop without responding. Instead, she put on a clean blouse, the one good one, the one she'd pressed the night before Austin, just in case. She brushed her hair back into a low bun, tied with the ribbon Mila had chosen for her at the dollar store. Then she walked 3 blocks to the address she remembered from a nameplate outside the Austin meeting. The door was open. The receptionist looked up, startled. Grace didn't stop. Inside the glass-walled office, the project director, she remembered his name was Keller, sat with a coffee in one hand and a spreadsheet in the other. When he looked up and saw her, his mouth opened, just slightly. "I read your note," she said. Keller blinked. Excuse me? You said my status was unconfirmed," she said, voice even. "That you needed clarification." He set down his coffee. "That was internal." Grace stepped forward. Not loud, not aggressive. "I'm not asking for access," she said. "But if you try to erase my voice again, I'll be the one writing the report that replaces you." Keller froze. For a moment, the only sound in the office was the low whir of the HVAC. Then Grace turned and walked out. Not a threat, a translation of earned respect. A week later, Grace stood by the river in Spokane, her hands wrapped around a ceramic mug too large for her fingers. The cafe was nearly empty, save for a few retirees and students tapping at keyboards. The smell of damp pine and roasted beans filled the air. Mila was perched at a table by the window, quietly assembling a postcard puzzle. Dean sat across from Grace. No laptop, no pitch deck, just presence. "I wanted this to feel human," he said. She sipped her coffee. "Not a boardroom." "No," he agreed. "That'll come later." They sat in silence for a moment. Then Grace said, "I don't have the degrees they do." Dean nodded. "You also don't have their blind spots." She looked at him, searching for insincerity. Found none. "Why Spokane?" He shrugged. "My mom grew up near here. It's where she used to bring me when things got hard. We couldn't afford much, but we could sit by the river and talk about what we wanted to become." "And what did you want to become?" Dean smiled faintly. "Someone who listened better than I was taught." Grace's gaze softened. Later, at the bookstore down the block, Mila picked up a card and brought it to the counter. Grace turned it over. Some people arrive so quietly, you can barely remember life before them. Dean didn't say a word, but when they stepped back into the autumn chill, he offered Mila his scarf without being asked. And Grace, for the first time in a long while, let someone else carry the bag. The terminal smelled faintly of old coffee and carpet cleaner. Grace stood near the arrivals board, bouncing Mila gently against her hip. Her daughter had long since stopped fussing, lulled into a warm stupor by the motion, the hum of voices, the echo of wheels on tile. Grace watched people drift past, some reunited in laughter, others moving like ghosts, eyes fixed ahead. She hadn't noticed him approach until he was beside her. Dean Carter. He didn't look like someone who should remember her. He was dressed simply, dark coat, carry-on in one hand, but everything about him was composed, practiced. A man used to being listened to, noticed. "I think we were on the same flight," he said. Grace turned slowly. Her expression didn't change. "Yes. I wanted to thank you," he continued calm, "for helping that tourist, and for correcting the translation. I wasn't trying to make a scene. You didn't. That's why I noticed." She didn't answer. Mila stirred, murmured something half asleep in Spanish. Grace adjusted her hold. Dean glanced down at the child, then back up. "I work in language tech," he said. "Education systems, mostly. We're trying to build something that teaches context, not just vocabulary. But our translations." He trailed off, then pulled out his phone, scrolling. "There's a document. Japanese. Would you mind taking a look?" He handed it to her. Grace scanned the screen once. Her brow furrowed. "You can't translate this word like that," she said. "It's not just a phrase, it's grief. It's ceremonial. You made it sound like a shipping delay." Dean blinked. "Exactly." She handed the phone back. "Do you do this professionally?" Grace gave a small, tired smile. "No. I work at a diner." He studied her. Not rudely, just intently. "Would you be willing to come to a meeting? No strings. Just observe. It's in Austin. A few linguists, a few developers. I just want you in the room." Grace raised an eyebrow. "Why?" Dean shrugged. "Because you hear what machines can't." She adjusted Mila's coat. "Is this an interview?" "No," he said. "It's an invitation. You can walk out anytime." Her eyes narrowed. "You don't even know me." "I don't need to," Dean said. "I already listened." Grace looked at him, really looked. The way he stood, casual but waiting. He didn't have the look of a recruiter or someone playing savior. If anything, he looked like someone who wasn't sure what to call what he just found. "I don't travel without her," she said, nodding toward Mila. "Of course not. No hotel rooms in your name. No meetings after 7. And no pitches over drinks." He smiled slightly. "You set the terms." Grace hesitated, then reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a pen. She flipped over an old receipt and scribbled a number. "My phone's old. Sometimes texts don't go through." He took it without reading. "I'll call." She nodded once. "Don't waste my time." "I won't." He started to leave, then turned back. "One more thing," he said. "That lullaby you were singing, Serbian, right?" Grace blinked, surprised. "My grandmother. She sang it to me when there was no food left." Dean nodded, quiet. "It stayed with you." Grace looked down at Mila, then back at him. "Yes," she said. "It did." And without another word, she turned and walked away, her daughter curled against her, her past echoing softly in a language no one else in that terminal could understand. But one man had listened, and that somehow had been enough. Grace didn't own a blazer. She debated stealing one from the thrift store on 5th. She had the receipt from an old donation and thought, if I pick something that once belonged to me, does it count? Instead, she wore a faded navy cardigan with a loose thread near the cuff, black jeans that didn't quite match, and boots with soles she'd glued together last winter. At the door to the Austin building, a security guard gave her a once-over. then gestured toward the elevator without asking questions. The lobby was marble and glass, sleek but quiet, like a library that cost 7 figures to build. Grace stepped in, the elevator's mirrored walls throwing her reflection back at her. Tired eyes, a mouth drawn too tight. She glanced at her phone. Mila was at a licensed daycare nearby, just for 2 hours. Paid in advance. Non-refundable. She would not be staying long. The conference room was on the 6th floor. Floor-to-ceiling windows. Concrete floors. Open ceilings with exposed piping and discreet pendant lights. Coffee brewed from some machine she couldn't name, and the furniture was the kind that said we work hard and we never leave. 12 people sat around a long walnut table. She knew none of them. Dean was there, but he didn't wave or nod. He barely looked her way. Grace recognized that for what it was, a kindness. She slid into a chair near the corner. No one asked who she was. One woman did glance sideways, a flicker of a smile that didn't touch her eyes. Grace smiled back, then stopped. The meeting began. A man with perfectly styled hair and a shaved jawline clicked through slides on a massive monitor. International rollout projections by Q3, he said. We've confirmed beta testing in 4 languages: Mandarin, French, Arabic, Hindi. Regulatory compliance is underway, except for one minor complication in Israel's accessibility clause. He moved on. Grace felt her pulse rise. He had said complication, but what he meant was, we're hoping no one notices. Another woman chimed in about tone-adaptive prompts for school districts in rural India. She used the phrase cultural smoothing like it was a feature. Grace folded her hands. This wasn't a translation meeting. This was a meeting about control. Are we tracking semantic drift in diasporic variants? Someone asked. No. It's low priority, another replied. Those aren't our core user bases. No one flinched. It wasn't malice. It was math. And then it happened. The man in the blazer returned to his point about Israeli compliance, quoting a clause he'd clearly never read in Hebrew. He referenced a 2014 document. Outdated, mistranslated, technically incorrect. Grace spoke without raising her voice. That clause was revised in 2019. You're quoting the old framework. The man paused. Excuse me? She repeated herself, adding, accessibility isn't optional there. Not anymore. He tried to recover. Our source flagged it as still active. Your source is outdated. Dean didn't move. The others looked at each other. Grace reached into her bag and pulled out a folded booklet. A side-by-side bilingual edition of the accessibility regulation. She placed it gently on the table. Page 6, second column. The man opened it. His brow furrowed. She's right, he muttered. Someone at the table whispered, who is she? No one answered. Dean looked up, met her eyes and gave a single nod. Let's continue. After the meeting, no one approached her. She stood by the windows while others filtered out. Her phone buzzed with a daycare reminder. 38 minutes left. She didn't leave. Dean found her by the coffee machine. He handed her a glass of water, not asking if she wanted it. You weren't supposed to speak, he said quietly. Grace shrugged. Then you shouldn't have invited me into a room full of half-truths. He smiled at that. Not mockery, just recognition. I didn't expect that document, he said. Most people in this room don't carry primary sources in their bag. I don't trust people who quote from memory, she said. Not when decisions are being made. Dean leaned against the counter. Do you know what you did? Grace raised an eyebrow. Corrected someone? No, he said. You shifted the room. No title. No authority. Just truth. That's not easy. She hesitated. Was it a test? Partly, Dean admitted. But mostly, I just wanted to see how long you'd stay invisible. She met his gaze evenly. So what happens now? Nothing, he said. You leave. I'll send a calendar invite. You can ignore it. Or not. No contract. No offer. She tilted her head. You're a strange recruiter. I'm not recruiting, he said. I'm building something. And I don't want to build it without people like you. Grace finished the water, set the glass down, and checked her phone. Mila hates applesauce, she said absently. Dean blinked. Okay. That daycare's going to give her some, she added. I told them not to. They always forget. She looked at him again. I'll come back. But not for you. And not for this room. Then for what? She turned to go, her voice low but sure. For her. The message came late. Not on a weekday morning when everything looked official, no. It arrived on a Sunday evening, the kind of hour when Grace was usually bent over a sink of dishes, humming quietly so Mila wouldn't feel the ache of their routines. Her laptop pinged once, half-muted under the clatter of drying plates. Grace wiped her hands on her jeans, flipped the screen open. The subject line was blank. The message itself was short. Her status is unconfirmed. Please clarify her authorization. No name, no punctuation, no courtesy, not even the dignity of a capital letter. Grace stared at it. She didn't feel anger at first. What she felt was something slower, older. Like standing in front of a door you've been shut out of before and finding the same lock waiting for you. Different building. Same key that doesn't turn. She didn't forward it. Didn't text Dean. Didn't fume on social media. She just read it again. Then closed the screen and walked into Mila's room. Her daughter was curled up on the carpet beside a stack of books. A doll under one arm. The kind of silence that only comes from deep concentration. She looked up when Grace entered, eyes bright. Look, Mama. I made a library. Grace smiled softly. Can I check something out? Mila nodded solemnly and handed her a paperback with a bent spine. Grace sat down beside her, legs crossed, resting the book in her lap. She didn't read, just listened to Mila hum, flipping imaginary pages of an imaginary world. And that was when the ache turned into clarity. She wouldn't explain herself. Not this time. The next morning, she dressed with purpose. Not with armor. Just truth. Black slacks she hadn't worn since the funeral of a neighbor. A gray sweater that smelled faintly of lavender soap. Hair tied back. Eyes steady. She didn't need an invitation. She already had presence. By the time she walked into the office, everything around her felt sharper. The lights too bright. The glass walls too clean. The buzz of efficiency without empathy. She passed a few familiar faces in the hallway. Engineers, analysts, people who looked through her instead of at her. One woman offered a polite nod, then immediately turned back to her screen. Grace didn't stop. She didn't soften. At the end of the hall was Keller's office, director of operations. Big name on a small door. She knocked once. No answer. So she walked in. Keller looked up from his desk, startled. His tie was loose, his laptop half closed. Oh, he said, blinking. Grace, right? She didn't answer. She held up her phone, turned the screen toward him. The email. I read your note, she said, voice calm. The one about authorization. He leaned back in his chair. His expression tried for surprise, but she caught the flicker, recognition. He knew exactly what she was talking about. That wasn't directed at you. No, Grace said. It was directed around me. Which is worse. He gave a rehearsed laugh. It's just protocol. We have to be cautious about who accesses proprietary information. We're under NDAs. Grace stepped forward. You think I don't know that? She asked, low and steady. I've translated contracts that decided the future of whole programs. I've mediated between governments who didn't even agree on what truth meant. Keller opened his mouth. Grace didn't stop. I don't need your authorization. I wasn't hired. I wasn't recruited. I was heard. And if that makes you nervous, maybe it should. He frowned now. You're overreacting. We just needed clarity. No, she said. You wanted permission to doubt me. That's different. She let the silence stretch. I'm not asking for access, she continued. I'm not asking for a title. But if you ever attempt to reduce me to a nameless risk again, I'll write the report that replaces you. Not out of spite, out of fluency, because I know the language of erasure, and I've stopped accepting the translation. Keller blinked once. His hands froze above his keyboard. Grace nodded, stepped back, and opened the door to leave, then paused. "I'll be in the room Monday," she said. "With or without your checkbox." She didn't wait for a response. She didn't need one. That night, Mila curled into her lap during dinner. The spaghetti was overcooked, the sauce thin. Grace didn't care. She stroked her daughter's hair with one hand and scrolled through her email with the other. The message was still there, unchanged, unretracted. She hit reply, typed 2 words, noted, JH, and hit send. It wasn't defiance. It was fluency. It was hers. The invitation came quietly. No letterhead. No agenda. Just a message from Dean. Spokane this weekend. River Cafe, 11 a.m. Bring Mila. No pressure. Grace read it 3 times. She didn't ask what the meeting was about. Didn't ask who would be there or what she was supposed to wear. Instead, she replied, "Okay." It was the shortest word in her vocabulary, and the one that had always cost her the most to say. They drove through the night. Mila slept most of the way, a pillow wedged between the car seat and window, her hand still clutching a toy owl with one ear missing. Grace kept the music low, mostly instrumental. Nothing with lyrics. Nothing that could echo back into her mind and unravel her. The road to Spokane was long and quiet, flanked by dark trees and rivers that shimmered briefly before disappearing into mist. Grace didn't rush. She stopped twice for gas and once for breath. At sunrise, Mila woke and asked, "Are we still going to the man with the good scarf?" Grace smiled. "Yes, baby." The River Cafe sat by the water with chairs that didn't match and windows that steamed in the morning sun. Inside, a waitress in a vintage apron refilled mugs without asking. Dean was already there. No laptop, just 2 coffees on the table, one black, one with milk. A seat left open for Mila with crayons already waiting. Grace walked in like she'd been there before. She hadn't, but something about the place felt familiar, like the kind of quiet you can trust. Dean stood briefly. "Hey." She nodded. "Hey." They didn't shake hands. Mila crawled into the booth and immediately started coloring. Grace sat opposite Dean, wrapped her hands around the warm mug, and waited. He didn't speak for the first few minutes. He let the clatter of plates and the sound of riverbirds fill the space instead. Then he said, "I didn't bring you here to impress anyone." Grace raised an eyebrow. "I didn't bring you here for investors. Or a pitch. I brought you here because I want to talk about what happens when people like you get erased from the room." Grace didn't reply right away. Dean went on, "I've been in enough boardrooms to know the kind of woman they want on the website. You're not that." "I know," she said evenly. "But I want the room to sound like you," Dean said. "Because if it doesn't, then the product won't either. And I'm not building something that sounds like privilege trying to pass as progress." He looked up at her now, eyes steady. "I'm not asking you to join a company. I'm asking you to help build something no one else has had the language for yet." Grace tilted her head. "Why me?" He paused. "Because when you corrected that translation, you didn't flinch. When you walked into Keller's office, you didn't ask permission. And when you speak to your daughter in 4 languages depending on how she's feeling, that's fluency we can't fake." The room went quiet. Mila, unaware of anything, held up a drawing of a blue fox. "For you," she said to Dean. He smiled. "Thanks, Mila." Grace watched him take it carefully, like it mattered. Then she looked at her daughter. Then the river. And finally back at him. "This isn't a job," she said. Dean nodded. "I know. I don't want meetings after bedtime. I don't want people asking what school I went to. I don't want to be tokenized, softened, or summarized." He nodded again. "Good. I want your voice as it is." Grace leaned back. Mila reached for her mug of hot chocolate, dribbling foam onto the table. Grace wiped it gently. Dean reached into his coat and pulled out a small stack of printed research notes. "No contracts today," he said. "But take this. Notes from last week's beta test. I want your eyes on it. And if something feels wrong, don't fix it. Just tell me why it is." Grace took the papers. "I'll look." "I know." Later, they walked along the river. The wind was gentle, cool enough for scarves. Mila collected pebbles. Grace stayed quiet. Outside a small bookstore, Dean paused and said, "She picked this for you." He handed her a postcard. It read, "Some people arrive so quietly you can barely remember life before them." Grace didn't speak, but her fingers held the card like something sacred. When Mila reached up and slipped her hand into Dean's, neither of them said anything. They just kept walking. That evening, after Mila had fallen asleep beside a pile of worn picture books, Grace stood in the hallway of the hotel with a folded piece of paper in her hand. The postcard. The edges had softened from the way she'd held it all afternoon, fingers brushing its corners like punctuation. She hesitated outside room 312, then knocked. Dean opened the door, surprised but not startled. He was barefoot, wearing an old hoodie, a half-read book in one hand. He said nothing, just stepped aside to let her in. Grace walked past him into the quiet room. "I don't need a title," she said, "and I'm not asking for guarantees." Dean set the book down. "Good," he said, "because I don't want to build this alone." They stood for a moment in the soft quiet of what wasn't yet defined. She sat down in the armchair. He poured tea. They didn't touch, didn't plan, just existed the way people do when nothing is being sold. Later, they moved to the porch, bundled in borrowed blankets. The night was cool. The river below hummed its steady rhythm. Grace stared out over the water, eyes unreadable. "For a long time," she said slowly, "I thought I had to run toward something. Money, stability, proof I mattered." Dean listened, but I was just running away from silence, from people who spoke over me, around me, through me. She turned to him. "You didn't ask me to speak. You made space when I did." Dean looked at her, not as a solution, not as a symbol, just her. "You heard me," she said. "That's the difference." And that was enough.